My business partner sold our company's core source code to a direct competitor for $100,000, purely to ruin me. He didn't do it for the money. $100,000 meant nothing next to what that code was actually worth. He did it because he wanted to watch me lose everything I had built, and he wanted a front row seat to it. I found out 3 days after the sale closed. I let him celebrate anyway. I let him take his new girlfriend to a steakhouse downtown and order the good bottle of wine and toast to finally being free of me. I let him post a vague, smug message online about new beginnings. I let him believe, for 6 full weeks, that he had gotten away with the cleanest betrayal of his life. He had no idea that 18 months earlier, buried inside our authentication system, I had written a specific piece of tracking code that activated the instant our software touched a server it had never been licensed to run on. He sold stolen property with a homing beacon built directly into it. Today, 2 federal agents walked into his office, badges out, and asked him to step away from his desk. Hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me if you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with everything. Let's get into exactly how this happened. My name is Owen Kessler, and I am 34 years old. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a small rented duplex on the west side of the city, where my mother worked nights as a respiratory therapist at the regional hospital, and my father drove a delivery route for a regional bakery supply company. Money was never plentiful in our house, but it was steady, and steady was its own kind of gift that I did not fully appreciate until I got older and watched other families deal with the specific chaos that came from money never being steady at all. I was an only child, and I spent an enormous amount of my early childhood alone, since my mother's night shifts meant she slept most mornings and my father left before sunrise. I filled those quiet hours with our family's old desktop computer, a beige tower that ran slower every year. And by the time I was 11, I had taught myself basic programming from library books because the internet at our house was too slow to reliably stream tutorials. My father noticed this obsession before anyone else did. He was not a technical man himself, but he understood the value of focus when he saw it in someone. One evening when I was 12, he came home with a second-hand programming book he'd found at a used bookstore near his delivery route, the pages slightly warped from age, and he set it on my desk without much comment. He said, "I don't understand a word of this, but you looked like you needed it." I read that book cover to cover in 11 days. School was a mixed experience for me. I was quiet, somewhat awkward socially, and far more interested in the logic puzzles hidden inside computer science than in the specific social performances that mattered so much to other kids my age. I found one real ally in high school, a computer science teacher named Mr. Halloran, who ran an after-school coding club that met in a repurposed supply closet with 4 donated computers. He pulled me aside during my junior year, after I'd finished a class assignment in roughly 1/10 of the time everyone else needed. He said, "Owen, you don't think about code the way most people think about code. Most people learn the syntax and follow the rules. You seem to understand what the rules are actually trying to accomplish underneath the syntax." I said, "I just want to know why something works, not just that it works." He said, "That's the difference between someone who writes programs and someone who builds systems. Hold on to that difference. It's rare." I went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship, studying computer science, and I worked part-time throughout college doing freelance web development for small local businesses, building simple websites and basic inventory systems for shops that could not afford a real development agency. It was unglamorous work, but it taught me something that mattered enormously later: how ordinary businesses actually used software, not the theoretical version taught in lecture halls, but the messy, practical version where a shop owner needed something that worked reliably more than something that was technically elegant. I graduated in 2013, and took a job as a junior developer at a mid-sized logistics software company in Columbus, building routing and inventory tools for regional trucking companies. I spent 4 years there, working my way up to a senior engineering role, and during that time, I noticed something that kept nagging at me every single day I sat at my desk. The logistics software our company built was powerful but bloated, designed for enterprise clients with massive IT budgets, and it left an enormous gap underneath it. Smaller trucking and freight companies, the kind with 10 to 50 trucks, who needed real routing optimization and inventory tracking, but could never afford or properly implement the enterprise tools our company sold. I started building something on the side in the evenings, a lightweight routing and fleet management platform specifically designed for small and mid-size freight operators, something that could run on a laptop instead of requiring a dedicated IT department. I built the first working version entirely alone, over about 14 months of evenings and weekends, and gave it a name that stuck: Hall Path. That was the year I met David Renner. David and I met at a regional logistics technology conference in Cincinnati in 2018, at a networking event that neither of us particularly wanted to attend. He was working, at the time, as a business development manager for a freight brokerage firm, and he had the specific gift of a person who could walk into a room of strangers and leave 40 minutes later, having collected a stack of contact information and a handful of genuine allies. We ended up sitting next to each other during a panel discussion, and afterward, over bad conference coffee, he asked what I did. I told him about Hall Path, still mostly a prototype at that point, running on a handful of test accounts I'd recruited from small freight companies around Ohio. He asked sharp, specific questions, not the polite surface-level questions most people asked when they didn't actually understand the technology, but real questions about unit economics, about how small freight operators actually made purchasing decisions, about what would convince a company running on paper logs and gut instinct to trust a piece of software instead. I said, honestly, the software is the easy part for me. Getting people to trust something new is the hard part. He said, that's exactly the part I'm good at. I've spent 6 years learning how skeptical, practical people in this industry actually make decisions. We talked for 2 more hours that evening, well past when the conference had officially ended for the day. And by the time we parted ways, we had a rough outline of what a real partnership could look like: me building and refining the product, him building relationships and driving actual sales into an industry that trusted almost nothing coming from outside itself. I left my logistics software job in early 2019, cashing out a modest retirement account to cover 6 months of expenses, and David left his brokerage role 2 months later once our first genuine paying customers came on board. We formed Hall Path Technologies as equal partners, 50-50, with David handling sales, partnerships, and client relationships, while I handled every line of the underlying product. The first 2 years were exactly as difficult as everyone who has built something from nothing tells you they are. We worked out of my apartment for the first 8 months, then a shared coworking space in Columbus once we had enough revenue to justify the expense. David was, in those early years, genuinely excellent at his role. He built relationships with freight operators across 3 states, understood their specific frustrations better than I ever could have on my own, and translated that understanding directly into feature requests that made the product sharper every quarter. By 2021, Hall Path had grown to serve over 300 small and mid-size freight companies across the Midwest, with annual recurring revenue crossing $4 million. We hired our first engineers, our first dedicated support staff, and moved into a real office space in a converted warehouse on the north side of Columbus. I want to be honest about something here because it matters enormously for what happened later. David and I were never close in the personal sense, even as our business grew successful together. We respected each other's competence completely, but we rarely socialized outside of work, rarely discussed anything beyond the company. And I never fully understood, in those early years, what specifically drove David beyond the general ambition that seemed to drive most people in our position. I found out gradually, through small signals I noticed but did not fully weigh at the time. David grew visibly frustrated whenever press coverage or industry recognition focused on the product itself rather than the sales growth. He grew tense during investor conversations whenever a potential backer asked more technical questions than commercial ones. He began, subtly at first, describing Hall Path in conversations with outside parties as something closer to his own creation than the equal partnership it actually was. The specific moment that revealed the depth of this tension happened in late 2022, when a private equity firm approached us about a possible acquisition, offering an initial verbal figure in the range of $22 million for the company. I was hesitant. Hall Path was still growing fast, and I believed, based on our trajectory, that waiting 18 to 24 months could substantially increase that number. David wanted to sell immediately. We had our first real argument about the company's direction over that decision, in the conference room of our own office, late on a Thursday evening. David said, "Owen, $22 million split between us is more money than either of us has ever had in our lives. Why are you gambling that away for a number that might not even materialize?" I said, "Because I built this product to solve a real problem, and I think we're still in the early innings of solving it. If we sell now, we're selling before we've captured most of the value we're actually capable of creating." He said, "That's easy for you to say. You get to sit behind a screen writing code all day. I'm the one out there every single week, managing the relationships, managing the stress of driving this thing forward. I want to see the number materialize while I still have the energy to enjoy it." I said, "I hear that, David, genuinely. But I think the smart decision here is patience, not urgency." We tabled the private equity offer, at my insistence, since my majority influence over the company's technical direction gave me significant weight in that particular decision, though our formal ownership remained equal. David agreed, reluctantly, to wait. I did not fully understand at the time exactly how much that disagreement had cost our partnership underneath the surface. I understood it completely 18 months later, when I discovered what David had actually done in response. In early 2023, roughly 4 months after the private equity disagreement, I made a decision that, in retrospect, turned out to be the single most important technical choice of my career, though I made it for reasons that had nothing to do with David at all. Hall Path's core routing and fleet management software ran on a licensing model tied to specific server deployments, since many of our larger clients preferred running the software on infrastructure they controlled rather than a shared cloud environment we managed for them. This licensing structure created a specific vulnerability that had bothered me for months. Nothing technically prevented a client, or anyone who obtained a copy of our code, from deploying it on unauthorized servers outside the terms of their license agreement. I built a solution into our authentication and licensing module, a piece of code embedded deep in the software's core verification system, designed to silently transmit a small diagnostic signal back to our central servers whenever the software initialized on any server environment that did not match an authorized license fingerprint already on file with us. I did not build this specifically to catch theft in the dramatic sense. I built it as a straightforward anti-piracy safeguard, the kind of thing any reasonable software company builds to protect its licensing revenue. I documented it internally in our engineering wiki under a section labeled Unauthorized Deployment Detection, and I mentioned it briefly to David at the time, though I want to be honest that I did not emphasize it, since it felt, at that point, like a minor technical detail rather than anything significant. David nodded when I mentioned it and moved the conversation along to a sales pipeline update. I do not believe, to this day, that he retained any real understanding of what that system actually did or how it worked. He was never a technical person, and he had, over our years together, developed the habit of tuning out anything that sounded like an engineering detail rather than a business one. That detail would become the single most important piece of information in this entire story. Through the remainder of 2023, tension between David and me continued building steadily, though I want to be honest that I did not fully register how serious it had become. We disagreed twice more about acquisition timing as additional offers came in, each time landing on my side of the argument, since my technical judgment about the product's remaining growth potential carried real weight with our board and our earliest investors. Each time, David's frustration grew a little sharper, a little more visible, though he always eventually agreed, at least outwardly, to defer to the collective decision. In January of 2024, a well-funded competitor entered our specific market segment for the first time, a company called FleetCor Systems, backed by significant venture capital, targeting the exact same underserved market of small and mid-size freight operators that Hallpath had spent 5 years building relationships within. FleetCor's product, based on what I could observe from the outside, was competent but noticeably behind ours in the specific routing optimization features that had always been our core differentiator. I did not think much of FleetCor initially, beyond normal competitive awareness. I certainly never imagined that David had, by that point, already begun a private conversation with their leadership team. I found out about the actual betrayal on a Tuesday morning in March of 2024, though I did not understand its full scope until several days later. I was reviewing our internal server logs that morning, a routine task I performed periodically as part of general system maintenance, when I noticed something unusual: an unauthorized deployment fingerprint alert, generated by the exact diagnostic system I had built over a year earlier, triggered from an IP address range registered to a data center in Northern Virginia that had no relationship to any of our licensed clients. I sat with that alert for a long moment before I fully processed what I was looking at. Our core source code, the entire authentication system, the routing optimization engine, the specific proprietary algorithms that had taken me 5 years to refine, had been deployed on infrastructure completely outside our licensing records. I ran a deeper trace on the deployment's network registration details, cross-referencing them against public corporate filings, and the data center's client registration information led directly back to FleetCor Systems. I sat at my desk for nearly an hour, processing what this meant. Our exact competitor, the one company positioned to take direct market share from us, was running our own source code on their own servers. I did not confront anyone immediately. I spent the following 2 days building a complete technical case, gathering every log entry, every deployment fingerprint, every piece of evidence I could assemble that proved definitively what had happened and roughly when it had started. On the 3rd day, I discovered the specific transaction that explained everything. Going through our own company's financial records, cross-referencing the exact week the unauthorized deployment first appeared in our logs, I found an entry in David's personal financial disclosures, which our company's operating agreement required both partners to periodically share with our outside financial advisor for tax planning purposes. A payment of $100,000, received via wire transfer from a shell entity that, after some additional research through public business registration records, traced back to FleetCor Systems' primary holding company. David had sold our source code to our direct competitor. I sat with that knowledge for a full week before I said a single word to anyone, including David. I want to explain exactly why I waited, because I think it matters for understanding what happened next. I understood from that first moment of discovery that the tracking system embedded in our authentication code meant FleetCor's unauthorized use of our software was not just a civil contract dispute between business partners. It was something significantly larger. A case involving trade secret theft and unauthorized computer access that fell squarely within federal criminal jurisdiction. Not merely a private lawsuit I would need to fund and fight myself. I needed to build the case completely, methodically, before I said anything to David or to anyone else, because the moment David realized I knew, he would have every incentive to destroy evidence, coordinate a cover story with FleetCor's leadership, or attempt to discredit whatever I eventually presented. I contacted an attorney privately, a sharp intellectual property litigator named Patricia Ayaki, who had handled a licensing dispute for us years earlier and whom I trusted completely. I laid out everything I had found. She said, "Owen, this is not just a business dispute. Depending on how deliberately David structured this sale, and depending on what FleetCor knew when they accepted the code, this could constitute a serious federal matter. I want you to stop investigating on your own immediately and let me bring in the right people." I said, "What does that mean practically?" She said, "It means we quietly document everything through proper legal channels, and we consider whether this needs to go to federal authorities, specifically the FBI's Cyber and Intellectual Property Crimes Unit, given the interstate nature of the theft and the scale of the financial harm involved." I said, "How long will that take?" She said, "These things take time to build correctly. I need you to be patient, and I need you to say absolutely nothing to David in the meantime." I agreed. That patience became the hardest 6 weeks of my professional life, because during that exact window, David was celebrating. I want to describe those 6 weeks honestly, because I think this is the part of the story that people find hardest to believe, and it is also the part I am least proud of, in the specific sense that watching it happen tested every ounce of restraint I had ever built in my life. David, believing his sale to FleetCor had gone completely undetected, began behaving differently almost immediately after the transaction closed. He grew visibly more relaxed in our office, less tense during our regular strategy meetings, and increasingly open about his frustration with our partnership in ways he had previously kept private. Roughly 2 weeks after I discovered the tracking alert, David took his new girlfriend, a woman named Caitlin he had been seeing for several months, to one of downtown Columbus's more expensive steakhouses, and posted a photograph online of the two of them with a bottle of wine, captioned with a vague reference to new beginnings and finally getting what he deserved. I saw that post. I sat with it for a long time. Around the same period, David began making unusually pointed comments during company meetings, comments that, understood in hindsight, were clearly building toward an eventual exit narrative he intended to use once FleetCor's competitive advantage became public. He suggested twice that Hallpath's growth had plateaued in ways that suggested we needed fresh strategic direction. He mentioned once, almost offhandedly, that he had been approached about other opportunities in the industry, a comment I now understood to be a deliberate signal he believed he was planting for future use, perhaps to explain an eventual departure from the company as something he had simply chosen rather than something connected to a federal investigation. I said nothing. I attended every meeting. I responded to every comment normally. I want to be honest that this required a level of discipline I did not know I possessed until I was forced to exercise it every single day for 6 consecutive weeks. Patricia's investigation, working alongside a forensic technology firm she brought in under attorney-client privilege, confirmed and expanded everything I had found on my own. The unauthorized deployment at FleetCor had been running continuously since the payment cleared, with FleetCor's own engineering team making minor modifications to our code. Modifications that, ironically, made the theft even easier to prove, since they created a clear, documented timeline of exactly when FleetCor had gained access to intellectual property that could only have originated from our own protected codebase. Patricia arranged a confidential meeting with an assistant United States attorney in the Southern District of Ohio, presenting the full technical case, the financial trail connecting David's payment to FleetCor's holding company, and the specific evidence showing deliberate, knowing use of stolen trade secrets across state lines. The Assistant U.S. Attorney's Office, after reviewing the case for roughly 3 weeks, opened a formal federal investigation, working alongside FBI agents from the Bureau's Cybercrimes Division, since the interstate transmission of stolen intellectual property and the deliberate circumvention of licensing protections fell within their specific jurisdiction. I learned, through Patricia, that federal investigators had begun quietly building their own independent case, corroborating our technical evidence with subpoenaed records from the data center hosting FleetCor's unauthorized deployment, and eventually with internal communications from FleetCor's own servers, obtained through a properly executed warrant that made explicit reference to the source of the code they were running. During this entire 6-week window, David and I continued operating Hall Path together, sitting across from each other in the same conference room, discussing product roadmaps and quarterly targets as though nothing at all had happened. The hardest single moment of that period came roughly 4 weeks in. During a Friday afternoon, one-on-one meeting David had requested specifically with me. He said, "Owen, I've been thinking a lot about where this company is headed, and honestly, about where I'm headed personally." I said, "What's on your mind?" He said, "I think I might be ready to step back from day-to-day operations, maybe explore something new. I've given this company everything for 5 years, and I think it's time I explored other opportunities that might be a better fit for what I actually want out of my career." I sat across from him, understanding completely that he was laying groundwork for an eventual exit he believed would look voluntary, an exit designed to distance himself from Hall Path before FleetCor's unauthorized use of our technology became impossible to hide. I said, "That's a big decision, David. Take whatever time you need to think it through carefully." He said, "I appreciate that. I think this might genuinely be for the best for both of us." I said, "I think you might be right about that." He had no idea how right I actually believed that sentence to be. 6 weeks after the initial discovery, Patricia called me on a Tuesday morning with an update that told me the investigation had reached its conclusion point. She said, "Owen, the U.S. Attorney's Office is ready to move forward. They have enough corroborated evidence between your technical logs, the financial trail, and FleetCor's own internal communications to proceed with search warrants and formal charges. I want you to be prepared for what happens over the next few days." I said, "What does that actually look like?" She said, "Agents will execute a warrant at FleetCor's offices to seize servers and records. Given David's direct financial involvement in the sale, agents will very likely want to speak with him directly as well, potentially at your own office, depending on how they choose to sequence things." I said, "Is there anything I need to do?" She said, "Continue exactly as you have been. Say nothing to David. Let the process unfold the way it's designed to unfold." 3 days later, on a Thursday morning in late April, I was in my own office, reviewing engineering sprint plans with 2 of our developers, when I heard unfamiliar voices near the front reception area of our building. I looked up through the glass wall of my office and saw 2 individuals in business attire, badges visible, speaking quietly with our office manager, who then pointed, with visible confusion, toward David's office at the far end of the floor. I watched from a distance as the 2 agents walked calmly toward David's office door and knocked. I did not leave my desk during what happened next, though I could see enough through the glass partitions of our open office layout to understand the general shape of events. David opened his office door, and I watched his posture change almost instantly, the specific full-body stiffening of someone realizing, in real time, that a moment he believed he had successfully avoided had simply been delayed rather than escaped entirely. The agent spoke with him quietly for several minutes. I could not hear the specific words from where I sat, but I watched David's face move through several distinct stages: confusion, then something closer to genuine fear, then a kind of hollow stillness that told me, even from across the room, that he understood exactly what this visit represented. He stepped out of his office with the agents roughly 10 minutes later, and as they walked toward the exit, he glanced across the office floor and found me at my desk. Our eyes met for perhaps 3 full seconds. I did not look away. I did not offer him anything readable in my expression, not satisfaction, not anger, simply a level, steady gaze that I think communicated, more effectively than any words could have, that I already knew everything he was about to be asked to explain. He looked away first. I learned the specific details of what followed over the subsequent weeks, partly through Patricia, partly through the eventual public court filings, once the case moved into its formal phase. Federal agents had, that same morning, executed a parallel search warrant at FleetCor Systems offices in Northern Virginia, seizing servers, internal communications, and financial records that corroborated everything our own technical evidence had already established. FleetCor's chief technology officer, facing his own significant legal exposure, agreed within days to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a more favorable resolution of his own potential charges, providing internal emails that made explicit reference to David's direct outreach, the specific negotiation of the $100,000 payment, an internal acknowledgement among FleetCor's leadership that the code they were receiving was proprietary material belonging to Hall Path. David, facing charges under federal trade secret theft statutes, along with charges related to unauthorized computer access, retained his own criminal defense attorney within days, and the specific tone of our professional relationship, unsurprisingly, shifted permanently and immediately following that Thursday morning visit. I want to describe the conversation David and I eventually had, roughly a week after the agent's visit, because I think it matters for understanding how this actually resolved between us as two people who had built something together, regardless of how it ended. He requested the meeting himself, at a coffee shop several blocks from our office rather than inside the building itself, and he arrived looking visibly diminished from the confident, relaxed version of himself I had watched celebrating just weeks earlier. He said, "I assume you knew," before they showed up. I said, "I found the deployment log almost 7 weeks before that. I built a case instead of confronting you directly, because I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I said anything." He said, 7 weeks. You sat across from me for 7 weeks knowing what I did." I said, "I did. I watched you take Kaitlyn to dinner to celebrate. I watched you plant your resignation story in our meetings. I let all of it happen because I needed the investigation to run its full course without you having any opportunity to interfere with it." He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "Why did you build that tracking system in the first place? Was it because you suspected something about me specifically?" I said, "No. I built it 18 months before any of this happened, purely as a licensing safeguard. I never suspected you specifically. I told you about it at the time, actually, though I don't think you retained much of that conversation." He said, "I don't remember that at all." I said, "I know. That's part of what happened here, David. You spent years tuning out the technical details of what I actually built, right up until those details became the exact thing that exposed you." He said after a long silence, "I wanted this company to feel like it was equally mine. I built relationships. I closed every deal. But every time investors asked technical questions, every time press coverage focused on the product, I felt like I was standing in a shadow I could never fully step out of. When FleetCor approached me, offering money for the code, it felt less like theft and more like finally getting paid for a part of this company I always believed was mine to sell. I said, "It was never yours alone to sell, David. That's the entire foundation of what a partnership actually means. You didn't just betray me financially. You made a decision, alone, about intellectual property that belonged to both of us equally, and you did it specifically to hurt me rather than simply to benefit yourself." He did not argue with that. He sat with it quietly for a long moment, and then he said something that I think was the most honest sentence he offered me across our entire 5-year partnership. He said, "I think some part of me always wanted you to fail publicly, so that my own success would finally feel like it belonged entirely to me, instead of something I was borrowing from your work." I said, "I'm sorry you carried that for as long as you did. I wish you had said something honest instead of doing something destructive." He nodded, and we did not speak again after that meeting, beyond the formal communications required by the ongoing legal proceedings. Hallpath survived the entire episode intact, and in some ways stronger than before. FleetCor Systems, facing its own significant legal exposure and the reputational damage of the case becoming public, collapsed within 4 months, its venture backers withdrawing support and its remaining assets eventually liquidated. Several of FleetCor's engineers, uninvolved in the original decision and eager to distance themselves from the collapse, reached out to us directly in the months that followed, and I ended up hearing 2 of them, genuinely talented people who had simply been caught working for leadership that made a catastrophic decision above their heads. I restructured Hallpath's ownership following David's departure, buying out his remaining equity stake at a valuation set through the legal proceedings. Using proceeds from a private equity investment, I finally agreed to accept roughly a year after the acquisition offer I had originally turned down, once our growth trajectory had proven exactly what I always believed it could become. I think about those 6 weeks more than almost anything else from my entire career, not because of the satisfaction of watching the truth eventually surface, but because of what they taught me about patience and about the specific discipline required to let a real process work correctly instead of reacting emotionally the moment I discovered a betrayal. I could have confronted David the day I found that deployment log. It would have felt good in the immediate sense to watch his face register that I knew, but it would have given him time to destroy evidence, coordinate a story with FleetCor, and very possibly avoid any real consequence for what he had done. Instead, I sat with a truth I could not yet act on for 7 long weeks, and I let the actual mechanism of justice do the work that anger alone never could have accomplished. That tracking system was never built as a trap for David specifically. I want to be honest about that, because I think the real lesson here is not about clever revenge. It is about the value of building things carefully, thinking several steps ahead, and protecting what you create, even when you cannot yet imagine exactly who might eventually try to take it from you. David was not a monster. He was a talented, driven person who let years of quiet resentment curdle into a decision he can never fully undo. I do not know exactly what his life looks like now, beyond what the court proceedings have made public, and I have made peace with not knowing more than that. What I do know is this: the work you do carefully, honestly, and with real foresight has a way of protecting itself, even in moments when you cannot personally be there to protect it. I did not catch David through anger. I caught him through a piece of code I built over a year before I had any reason to suspect him of anything at all. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button right now. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my position, sitting across from someone you trusted for 7 weeks, knowing exactly what they had done. Subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell, because every week I bring you a story like this one, real, and worth every minute of your time. I read every single comment. Thank you for being here.